January 10, 1870. Cleveland, Ohio. A man who sold fake medicine, committed bigamy, and vanished without a trace? That the very foundations of America's oil empire, Standard Oil, were built not just with steel and sweat, but on ledger paper, paranoia, and prayer? And that the man behind it all, John D. Rockefeller, believed he was carrying out the will of God, while buying up his competitors, shutting down their dreams, and reshaping capitalism forever? This is the story they don't tell in business school. This is the buried origin of America's oil dynasty. This is the real John D. Rockefeller. It's 1839. In the small town of Richford, New York, a baby is born to a marriage built on deception. His name is John Davidson Rockefeller, and from his first breath, he's surrounded by lies. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, or Big Bill as he liked to be called, wasn't just unreliable. He was a professional fraud. Picture this. A man traveling from town to town, selling miracle cures made from herbs in his mother's garden, promising desperate farmers that his potions could cure cancer, consumption, even broken hearts. But the medicine was fake. And Big Bill? He knew it. When the fake medicines made their money, Big Bill moved to an even darker business, predatory lending. He'd loan money to struggling farmers at impossible interest rates, then seize their properties when they couldn't pay. It was economic vampirism, and Big Bill was very, very good at it. Now here's where the story gets truly twisted. While courting young Eliza Davidson, John's future mother, Big Bill conveniently forgot to mention one crucial detail. He was already engaged to another woman, Nancy Brown, beautiful, penniless, and completely unaware that her fiancé was simultaneously wooing a rich farmer's daughter 30 miles away. Big Bill married Eliza in February 1837, bringing her home to live with Nancy. Yes, you heard that right. The wife and the mistress under the same roof. And Big Bill? He saw nothing wrong with this arrangement. For 2 years, this bizarre household continued. Eliza gave birth to John in 1839. Nancy had 2 daughters of her own. The women, remarkably, maintained cordial relations during Big Bill's frequent and suspiciously long absences from home. But imagine being young John, growing up in this house of secrets, watching his mother's quiet humiliation, seeing his father as both provider and source of endless anxiety, learning that the man who should represent strength and security was actually chaos incarnate. When John was 3, the family moved to Moravia. By then, the community pressure had forced Big Bill to send Nancy and her daughters away, but the damage was done. John had learned his first life lesson. The world is unpredictable, and survival requires constant vigilance. His mother, Eliza, became his anchor. Deeply religious, quietly strong, she ran the household with iron discipline whenever Big Bill disappeared, which was often. She taught John to think before acting, to save every penny, to never trust appearances. And perhaps most importantly, she taught him that God rewards the righteous. But what happens when a child tries to reconcile his mother's teachings about righteousness with his father's obvious success through deception? What psychological architecture does that build in a young mind? John became obsessively methodical. While other children played impulsively, he calculated every move in checkers, every trade when selling candy to his siblings. He raised turkey chicks not for pets, but for profit. At age 7, his schoolmates found him strange, too serious, too calculating. But John was building something inside himself, a system of control that could withstand any chaos his father might bring home. And chaos was coming. In 1849, the law finally caught up with Big Bill. Sexual assault charges. The details were hushed up, but the family had to flee Moravia in the middle of the night. They moved to Owego, then Strongsville, Ohio, then Cleveland, always one step ahead of Big Bill's reputation. It was around this time that something fundamental shifted in John's relationship with his father. The hero worship ended. He stopped talking about Big Bill to his friends. In fact, he started referring to his mother as a widow. A widow, while his father was still alive. Think about that for a moment. A teenage boy so ashamed of his father that he pretends the man is dead. What does that do to someone? What kind of adult does that create? By 1855, John was 16 and about to graduate from high school. He had dreams of college, maybe even university. He was friends with Mark Hanna, who would later become one of the most powerful politicians in America. The future looked bright. Then Big Bill dropped his final bombshell. He'd been living a double life in Canada, courting a 17-year-old girl named Margaret Allen. He'd told her he was single, of course. Now he wanted to marry her, bigamously, and he needed his eldest son to drop out of school and start supporting the family. John D. Rockefeller's formal education ended there, not because his family was poor, but because his father was a criminal who needed financial cover for his crimes. The boy who would become America's first billionaire never went to college. Instead, he learned his most important lesson in a moment of pure abandonment. If he wanted security, if he wanted respect, if he wanted to be nothing like his father, he would have to build it himself. And he would have to build it so strong, so unshakable, that no scandal could ever touch him again. That autumn, 16-year-old John Rockefeller walked the streets of Cleveland, looking for work. He carried a list of every business in the city, and he visited them one by one, asking if they needed a bookkeeper. What he was really asking was this: will you give me the chance to prove I'm nothing like my father? On September 26, 1855, a small merchant firm called Hewitt and Tuttle said yes. John would celebrate September 26th as Job Day for the rest of his life. More important to him than his birthday, more significant than Christmas. Because September 26th was the day he stopped being Big Bill Rockefeller's son and started becoming something else entirely. But what exactly? A savior of American industry? Or something much darker? If you want to understand how John D. Rockefeller built the world's greatest fortune, you have to understand this. Everything he did was a reaction to his father's chaos. Where Big Bill was unpredictable, John became methodical. Where Big Bill made handshake deals, John documented everything. Where Big Bill charmed his way out of problems, John built systems so robust that problems couldn't arise. At Hewitt and Tuttle, young Rockefeller arrived at 6:30 every morning and often worked past 10 p.m. But he wasn't just working, he was studying. How did money flow? Who could be trusted? What made businesses succeed or fail? He kept meticulous records of everything in a red notebook he called Ledger A. Every penny accounted for, every transaction documented. It was the opposite of his father's chaotic, undocumented schemes. And here's something remarkable. As soon as John started earning money, he began giving it away. 10% of his income went to charity. The boy who'd grown up surrounded by his father's greed became obsessively generous. But why? Was it genuine kindness? Or was it something else? Was John trying to buy absolution for his father's sins? Was he building a public reputation so sterling that no scandal could touch him? Maybe both. Maybe that's what made him so effective. By 1858, John had saved enough to start his own business with an English friend, Morris Clark, Rockefeller and Company. They traded commodities, grain, meat, whatever Cleveland's growing population needed. And almost immediately, John displayed the trait that would make him billions. He thought in systems. While other traders focused on individual deals, John saw the entire supply chain. Who controlled transportation? Who had the best relationships with suppliers? How could efficiency be improved at every step? The business thrived, but John was already looking ahead. In 1859, something happened in Pennsylvania that would change everything. Edwin Drake struck oil near Titusville. America was hungry for light. Whale oil was becoming scarce and expensive. This new rock oil could be refined into kerosene, clean, bright, affordable illumination for the masses. Within months, the Pennsylvania oil fields were swarming with speculators. Fortunes were made and lost overnight. It was exactly the kind of chaotic, boom or bust environment that reminded John of his father's world. And that's precisely why he knew he could dominate it. In 1863, John and his partners built their first oil refinery, the Excelsior Oil Works. While everyone else was rushing to drill for crude oil, John focused on refining it. Let others take the risk of dry wells and price crashes. He would build the infrastructure to process whatever oil they found. It was a brilliant insight, but it came with a problem. His partner Morris Clark thought John was moving too fast, borrowing too much, taking too many risks. Sound familiar? John was displaying the same aggressive expansion instincts as his father, but with one crucial difference. John's risks were calculated, documented, systematic. The tension came to a head in early 1865. Clark wanted to slow down. John wanted to accelerate. The partnership was unsustainable. They decided to auction the company to the highest bidder. Picture this scene. Two young men, barely in their 20s, bidding against each other for control of what would become the world's largest oil empire. The bidding starts at $500. It climbs to $60,000. Then $70,000. John is stretching his credit to the absolute limit. One more bid could bankrupt him. Clark bids $72,000. Without hesitation, John responds, $72, $500. Clark stares at him. After what feels like an eternity, Clark shakes his head. He can't go higher. For $500, the margin of victory, John D. Rockefeller just bought his destiny. Years later, Rockefeller would say that those $500 were the making of him. But I think it was something deeper than money. In that moment, John proved to himself that he could win against a partner who wanted to limit him, just as he'd been limited by his father's demands. He was free, and he was dangerous. Within 5 years, the Rockefeller refineries were the largest in the world. But John wasn't satisfied with being the biggest. He wanted to solve what he saw as the fundamental problem with the oil industry: chaos. Too many companies, driving prices down through ruinous competition. Too much waste, too much inefficiency, too much chaos. John D. Rockefeller looked at the American oil industry and saw his childhood home. Multiple competing interests, no clear authority, endless conflict. And just as he'd learned to bring order to his family's chaos, he decided to bring order to an entire industry. The question was, how far would he go? On January 10, 1870, John D. Rockefeller incorporated the Standard Oil Company. Capitalization, $1 million. Mission, to bring order to the American oil industry. What that actually meant, John kept to himself. But within 2 years, his methods would earn a name that still haunts American business: the Cleveland Massacre. The Cleveland Massacre wasn't a single day of violence. It was something more psychological, and arguably more brutal. Between December 1871 and March 1872, John D. Rockefeller systematically eliminated 22 of his 26 competitors in Cleveland, not through price wars or hostile takeovers, but through a weapon far more devastating: superior information. Here's how it worked. Rockefeller had negotiated secret agreements with the railroads. In exchange for guaranteed shipping volumes, Standard Oil received massive rebates on transportation costs. But the railroads gave him something even more valuable: detailed information about his competitors' shipping patterns. John knew exactly how much oil each rival company was producing, where they were shipping it, and what it was costing them. He had perfect intelligence on his competition while they operated blind. Armed with this information, John would visit his competitors personally. He'd arrive at their offices with Standard Oil's account books, spread them across their desks, and show them something impossible. Standard Oil could sell kerosene at a profit for less than it cost his competitors to produce it. The conversations were polite, civilized, devastating. "Gentlemen," John would say in his calm, measured voice, "we can do this business more efficiently together than apart. I'm prepared to offer you Standard Oil stock in exchange for your assets." It wasn't technically a threat, but everyone understood the subtext. Join us, or we'll destroy you. Colonel Oliver Payne, John's old high school friend and owner of the largest competing refinery, asked to see Standard's books. When he realized how profitable the company was, he didn't just sell. He joined John's inner circle. One by one, Cleveland's oil men capitulated. Some went quietly, grateful for the Standard Oil stock that would make them wealthy. Others resisted until John simply undercut their prices, driving them into bankruptcy before buying their assets for pennies on the dollar. By the end of the Cleveland massacre, Standard Oil controlled a quarter of the world's oil refining capacity. John justified his actions with religious language. He called Standard Oil an ark that could save the industry from the flood of ruinous competition. He genuinely believed he was performing a service, bringing stability to an inherently chaotic business. But his competitors saw something else. A systematic campaign of corporate warfare led by a man whose childhood had taught him that survival required total control. The critics weren't entirely wrong. John's methods grew more sophisticated as Standard Oil expanded beyond Cleveland. Secret ownership of competing companies, industrial espionage, predatory pricing designed to bankrupt rivals before acquiring their assets. When independent oil producers in Pennsylvania built the Tidewater pipeline to bypass Standard's transportation monopoly, John's agents tried to buy every piece of land along the route to block construction. When that failed, they allegedly bribed legislators to vote against pipeline permits. The Tidewater pipeline was completed anyway, but not before John had demonstrated something chilling. There was virtually no limit to what he would do to maintain control. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled 90% of America's oil refining capacity and most of its pipeline network. John D. Rockefeller had achieved something unprecedented in American history, a near-total monopoly over an essential industry. He was also becoming the most hated man in America. Journalists began investigating Standard Oil's practices. The most devastating critique came from Ida Tarbell, a reporter whose father had been driven out of business by Standard's tactics. Her exposé, published in McClure's magazine, revealed the full scope of John's empire, the secret rebates, the shell companies, the systematic destruction of competition. Americans were horrified. This wasn't capitalism as they understood it. This was something closer to feudalism, with John D. Rockefeller as an unelected economic king. Politicians responded with antitrust legislation. The Sherman Act of 1890 specifically targeted monopolistic practices. State governments filed lawsuits demanding that Standard Oil be broken up. John fought back through his lawyers, but the pressure was relentless. In 1906, the federal government filed a comprehensive antitrust case against Standard Oil. The case took 5 years to resolve. During that time, John faced the most intensive scrutiny of his life. Every business decision was examined, every relationship questioned, and inevitably, investigators began digging into his family history. In 1908, the press finally uncovered the story John had spent 50 years trying to bury: his father's bigamous marriage. Big Bill's double life became front-page news across America. Imagine the psychological impact. John had built the world's largest corporation, accumulated unprecedented wealth, become one of the most powerful men in human history, all while running from his father's shame. And now, at the moment of his greatest legal peril, that shame was exposed anyway. The Supreme Court ruling came on May 15, 1911. Standard Oil was ordered to dissolve within 6 months, broken into 34 separate companies. John D. Rockefeller had lost. Or had he? Here's where the story takes its most unexpected turn. The breakup of Standard Oil should have been John D. Rockefeller's financial ruin. Instead, it made him the richest man who had ever lived. Here's what the government didn't anticipate. When Standard Oil was split into 34 companies, John remained the largest shareholder in each one. Suddenly, instead of owning one monopoly, he owned stock in 34 companies that were free to compete and innovate. ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, Marathon. These weren't just the companies that emerged from Standard Oil. They were John's companies, and their stock prices soared. By 1916, 5 years after the devastating antitrust ruling, John D. Rockefeller had become America's first billionaire. The government had tried to punish him for his monopolistic practices and accidentally made him richer than anyone in human history. But something else happened during those antitrust proceedings. Something that would define John's legacy far more than his business empire. Facing intense public scrutiny, watching his father's secrets exposed in newspapers across America, John began to seriously confront a question that had haunted him since childhood. What kind of man was he really? His critics called him a robber baron, a monopolist who had crushed the American dream of fair competition. His supporters argued he was an industrial visionary who had brought order and efficiency to a chaotic industry. John himself seemed genuinely uncertain. In his private correspondence from this period, we see a man wrestling with profound questions about wealth, responsibility, and legacy. He'd achieved everything his traumatic childhood had driven him toward: financial security, social respectability, unshakable power. But he'd also become exactly what his father's victims had accused Big Bill of being: a man who used superior resources to exploit those with less. The psychological weight of this realization seems to have been enormous. Starting in the 1890s, John began giving away money on an unprecedented scale. Not just charity, systematic philanthropy designed to address the root causes of human suffering. The University of Chicago, Rockefeller University, the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, Spelman College, the historically black women's college named after his wife's family. These weren't just donations. They were institutions designed to last for centuries. John was trying to build something that would outlive both his business empire and his father's infamy. But perhaps the most revealing philanthropic venture was the Rockefeller Foundation, established in 1913 with an initial endowment of $183 million. Roughly $5 billion in today's money. The foundation's mission statement was telling: to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. Think about that phrase. The well-being of mankind throughout the world. This from a man who'd spent 30 years systematically destroying his business competitors, who'd built his fortune through methods that many considered borderline criminal. Was this genuine moral transformation? Or was it the most sophisticated public relations campaign in history? Maybe the answer is both. Maybe that's what makes John D. Rockefeller so fascinating and so unsettling. His philanthropy wasn't just generous, it was revolutionary. The Rockefeller Foundation pioneered public health initiatives that saved millions of lives. It funded research that led to vaccines, antibiotics, and modern medical education. John personally designed many of these programs, applying the same systematic thinking that had built Standard Oil. He studied social problems like he'd studied the oil industry, looking for leverage points where strategic investment could create massive, lasting change. In many ways, his philanthropy was more effective than his business empire. But here's what's truly remarkable. Even as John was giving away unprecedented sums of money, he continued to struggle with his fundamental question of identity. In 1914, his family's company, Colorado Fuel and Iron, was involved in a labor dispute that turned violent. National Guardsmen and private security forces attacked striking workers, killing over 20 people, including women and children. The Ludlow Massacre, as it became known, was a public relations catastrophe for the Rockefeller family. John Jr., who was directly responsible for the company's response to the strike, faced intense criticism. John Sr.'s reaction was telling. Rather than distancing himself from the controversy, he supported his son's hardline approach to the strike. The same man who was spending millions to improve human welfare also approved of violent suppression of workers seeking better conditions. It was as if two completely different men occupied the same body. The philanthropist genuinely concerned with human suffering, and the industrialist who viewed labor disputes as threats to be eliminated. Perhaps this contradiction explains why John remained so private throughout his life. He gave interviews rarely, avoided public appearances, and seemed genuinely uncomfortable with attention. He knew better than anyone that John D. Rockefeller contained multitudes, and not all of them were admirable. In his final years, living between his estate in New York and his winter home in Florida, John achieved something his father never had: genuine respectability. He was still one of the richest men in the world, but his reputation had evolved from robber baron to elder statesman. Presidents sought his counsel. Universities competed for his donations. The same journalists who had once vilified him now wrote respectful profiles of his philanthropic work. When John D. Rockefeller died on May 23, 1937, just weeks before his 98th birthday, Standard Oil companies around the world observed a 5-minute silence in his honor. The boy who had grown up in shame had died with global recognition. But what exactly was his legacy? John D. Rockefeller has been dead for nearly 90 years, but we're still trying to answer the question he spent his lifetime avoiding. Was he a force for good or evil? The numbers seem to offer clarity. During his lifetime, John gave away over $540 million, equivalent to roughly $16 billion today. His foundations have donated tens of billions more since his death, funding medical research, education, and public health initiatives that have improved millions of lives. Standard Oil's breakup led to innovations that might never have occurred under monopoly conditions. The companies that emerged from its dissolution became leaders in petrochemical research, automotive fuel development, and global energy infrastructure. Without John D. Rockefeller, America might not have become the dominant economic power of the 20th century. But those same numbers tell another story. At the height of his power, John controlled an estimated 2% of America's entire gross domestic product. No individual in history, not even today's tech billionaires, has wielded comparable economic influence. He achieved this dominance through methods that are still studied in business schools as examples of anti-competitive behavior: price manipulation, information asymmetry, strategic bankrupting of competitors. The human cost of his empire building was enormous. Thousands of small business owners were driven into financial ruin. Entire communities built around independent oil production were economically devastated when Standard Oil moved in. So which story is true? The philanthropist who revolutionized charity and saved countless lives? Or the monopolist who crushed the American dream of independent enterprise? Maybe the real lesson of John D. Rockefeller's life is that both stories are true, and that's what makes him so profoundly human. Think about his psychology. A child raised in chaos, taught that survival required constant vigilance and perfect control. A young man who discovered that systematic thinking could generate unprecedented wealth and power. An adult who used that wealth and power to build institutions designed to outlast his own mortality, perhaps because he understood, better than most, how quickly everything could be taken away. John's relationship with his father may hold the key to understanding his contradictions. Big Bill Rockefeller was a chaos agent, charming, destructive, ultimately selfish. He took what he wanted without considering the consequences for others. John became Big Bill's opposite: methodical, constructive, obsessively concerned with long-term consequences. But in rejecting his father's chaos, did he go too far in the other direction? Did his need for control become its own form of destruction? Perhaps John D. Rockefeller's greatest achievement wasn't his business empire or even his philanthropy. Perhaps it was proving that humans can fundamentally change who they are. The boy who grew up surrounded by lies became obsessively honest in his business dealings. So much so that his word was considered more valuable than most written contracts. The child who experienced financial insecurity became so wealthy that his family's foundations continued to give away money more than a century after his death. The young man who was abandoned by his father became a devoted family man who carefully planned his children's education and moral development. But transformation is never complete. John's methods of achieving control often mimicked his father's disregard for others' welfare. His systematic approach to business sometimes became systematic oppression of competitors. He spent his life trying to become everything his father wasn't, and largely succeeded. But in the process, he may have become something equally troubling. A man so focused on preventing chaos that he couldn't tolerate any challenge to his vision of order. This matters today because John D. Rockefeller's story is being repeated in different forms across Silicon Valley, Wall Street, and boardrooms around the world. Tech entrepreneurs who concentrate unprecedented wealth and power while claiming to make the world better. Financial titans who optimize systems for efficiency while ignoring human costs. Corporate leaders who use their resources to shape society according to their personal visions of progress. Are they following John's philanthropic model or his monopolistic one? Maybe both, just as he did. John D. Rockefeller died believing he had lived a righteous life. His foundations had saved millions from disease and ignorance. His business innovations had helped fuel American prosperity. His personal conduct had been guided by sincere religious faith. He also died knowing that his business empire had been built through methods that many considered morally questionable. That his pursuit of efficiency had sometimes required ruthless elimination of human obstacles. That his vision of order had often meant the destruction of others' dreams. Maybe that's the most honest way to evaluate any human life. Not as purely good or evil, but as a complex mixture of noble aspirations and problematic methods. John D. Rockefeller wanted to be remembered as a man who brought order to chaos, prosperity to scarcity, and healing to suffering. He largely succeeded in those goals. He also wanted to be nothing like his father, and in that, he may have succeeded too well. Big Bill Rockefeller was a small-time con artist whose crimes affected dozens of people over a few decades. John D. Rockefeller was a systematic empire builder whose decisions affected millions of people across multiple centuries. In trying to become his father's opposite, John may have become something more dangerous, a man with the power to reshape society according to his personal trauma. The question isn't whether John D. Rockefeller was good or evil. The question is, what happens when someone's childhood wounds become powerful enough to reshape the world? And in a world where individual wealth and power continue to concentrate at unprecedented levels, that might be the most important question we can ask. This has been Trueline Files. I'm your host, and until next time, keep questioning the stories we tell ourselves about power, wealth, and human nature. Because the truth is always more complex than we want to believe. What do you think? Was John D. Rockefeller a visionary who built the foundation of American prosperity, or a monopolist who concentrated dangerous power in the hands of one man? Maybe the answer changes depending on whether you're asking about his business empire or his philanthropic legacy. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to dive deeper into the psychology of America's industrial titans, hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories that will challenge everything you think you know about wealth, power, and human nature. Next time on Trueline Files, the woman who built a beauty empire by selling hope to people society had forgotten, and how her personal quest for dignity became a revolution that transformed American culture. See you then.